Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Liliana Rincon-Gonzalez. I'm the Program Director for Clinical Sciences and for the EFS initiative here at MDIC. It is my pleasure to co-host this webinar with the group at Baylor. This is the second legal roundtable on the EFS Master Clinical Trial Agreement. Some of you attended the first meeting last year, and some of you are new this year. We're happy to have you all here, and thank you for providing comments and edits to the template. Jamie and the Baylor team will go over the meeting objectives and get the webinar started. But before I hand it to Jamie, I wanted to let everyone know that this meeting is done in a webinar format, and so most of you are muted to reduce background noise. And if you have any questions or comments, please use the Q&A box, and if needed, we can unmute you. Finally, the recording will be available at the MDIC website sometime after the meeting. And since we only have 1 hour, I will pass it to Jamie.
Thank you, Liliana. Hi, I'm Jamie Well-Koliak. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Baylor Scott & White Research Institute. And I thought it would be helpful to start off with a little bit of background information about the legal roundtable that we hosted in Dallas a year and a half ago. So the EFS Master Clinical Trial Agreement process was really an evolving process that started with a small working group. So the FDA has put a lot of time and effort into developing the EFS program, and they created a lot of efficiencies at the regulatory level to accelerate that process. However, they were noticing with sponsors that they were having a difficult time at the site level really getting these studies up and running and enrolling patients. And so MDIC started a working group to look at some of the issues that regularly come up. And they thought they'd focus first on the contracting process, since that seemed to take the longest amount of time to actually get these studies up and running. So as a result, the MDIC approached 4 attorneys that represented sites and sponsors. So it was a small group that started those initial discussions on some of the key terms, those key choke points that come up over and over again in your contract. And from that, they decided it would be great to put together language libraries, so terms that have been agreed to in previous EFS agreements by sites and sponsors. And we thought that if we created those language libraries, it would just be an easier way for sites and sponsors to go to them and utilize them when they were having trouble executing and finalizing these agreements. And I think what was so great about the language libraries was mainly the commentaries that went along with them. Not only were there negotiated terms that you could plug into an agreement, but there are actually sections developed that had comments on when it would be appropriate to deviate from those terms, or if there are any other suggestions that you may have if you're coming to a choke point and you really feel like you're not making any progress. Maybe you could look at it a little bit differently or suggest some other terminology for any given provision. So we presented those language libraries to an executive committee. So the MDIC has an EFS executive committee, and these were presented at a dinner, and they loved this, and they thought it was such a great idea to have these language libraries, but they said, why don't we take it one step further and actually create a master agreement that would benefit large sponsors, small companies that are starting up that really don't have in-house attorneys. So this would be very helpful for them to have a tool to go to when necessary. And then also at the site level, so you could really just spend your resources focusing on the negotiations that are really important to the institution, especially if you had an agreed upon document that you could start with. So with the initial set of attorneys, we came back around and we took an agreement that was sent from a sponsor, and that sponsor let us use one of their master clinical trial agreements that we started from, and we started inserting the language library into that agreement. And we also went through a number of contracts that have been exercised and agreed to by both sites and sponsors for EFS trials, and we plugged in a number of those provisions. We then harmonized that document, and that document was sent out to all participants before the meeting. Several people actually sent in some of their revisions before we even had the meeting, which was really helpful in terms of starting those discussions on the key choke points when we were in person. We held the legal roundtable in Dallas, February 8th and 9th, 2018, and we had 22 representatives there, so legal representatives from both sites and sponsors. We also had a representative from the FDA as well as the MDIC at the legal roundtable. So as we started with those language libraries, we went back to the choke points, day one, and we led discussion for each of those choke points. And it was really incredible just to have that face-to-face meeting and to make those changes to the agreement in real time. We spent over 2 hours discussing intellectual property, for example, because we really didn't know some of the rationale and reasoning for the changes before getting together and discussing it. And I think it was really helpful and telling to get together and have those critical discussions and to understand a sponsor's perspective as well as a site's perspective and why some of those changes were necessary. So day 1 and 2, we focused on going through all of the agreements, and the goal was to come up with probably a document that was 90% agreeable by all. We understood that we weren't going to get to 100% for every sponsor and for every site, but at least with an agreement that you could accept 90% of, you could then focus your negotiations on that remaining 10%. So making the changes in real time, everyone had the opportunity to comment on them. And then we sent out the draft at the end of the meeting, so everyone that participated had the opportunity to take that document back to their organization, discuss any remaining issues or concerns internally, and provide feedback that we could then generate either into the document or as a supplemental material. And one of the things that we did do is create that master clinical trial agreement that came out of the legal roundtable, but I think one of the most beneficial documents that we also created was the terms that we would need to change for any given sponsor or site. So you have your master template agreement, and then you have a document that lets you know which site or which sponsor would need to change a particular term and why. So this really helps you focus your negotiations if you're utilizing the master clinical trial agreement for early feasibility studies. So with that, I would like to now turn it over to Mitch Dean. He's an attorney here at Baylor Scott White Research Institute, and he's going to talk a little bit more about the goals for today.
Thanks, Jamie. I'm Mitch Dean, and I'm Vice President and Assistant General Counsel at Baylor Scott & White, and I serve as the General Counsel of the Research Institute. And after the conclusion of the legal roundtable, everyone really felt like it was a success. And then Jamie came to me and said, we're going to virtualize this because we really wanted to continue that work and get more progress and even further refine this tool that we had in the MCTA. So I want to kind of tell you what we did to get ready for this and how we're going to proceed through the webinar. I do want to say at the outset, we are experimenting with this format, so we would really love feedback from you about whether you think this works as a webinar, what you like, and certainly what you don't like about it. That's valuable feedback too, because we'd really, the in-person meetings are really great. We like them. They're a budget concern for folks, and so if we can make meaningful progress doing this type of work via webinar, we'd really like to. So love to hear from you about that. So as you know, when you signed up to participate, you were asked for your feedback in advance on the existing document that had been agreed to after the legal roundtable in 2018. We received fantastic feedback. 15 different participants sent meaningful and substantive feedback to us. And I do have to recognize in front of everyone Ashley Dowell and Shannon Briones, who took many, many hours beyond what you could probably imagine to take all of the feedback, build it into beautiful, accessible pivot tables so that we could do good, deep analysis on your feedback and really consider it meaningfully for inclusion into what we have created now, which is in draft, which you will receive after it's finalized. And that is a draft version 2 of the MCTA. As an aside, obviously, not all feedback was incorporated into the edits that we made. We had to make decisions about that based on a number of factors, including how many people requested certain changes, and the discussions that had been had in person, and what we knew would be problematic for, if we knew something, for example, would be problematic for a large number of sponsors or a large number of institutions, we either had to make a decision not to include it, or in a lot of cases made a decision about a compromise that was close to but not exactly what had been requested from sites or sponsors. So that was kind of our process as we prepared that. I want to make a note here. After we run through and show you, and we're not going to review all the substantive edits in our 1 hour today. What we elected to do was to show you the new edits that analysis of your feedback yielded on what Jamie referred to as the choke point sections, those heavily negotiated things that just tend to be problems. We thought if you saw some of those edits, and in a couple of cases we have representatives from sites here to speak about particular edits that they requested. We thought that would be good for people to hear when they see the edits on the slides and understand from these participants' perspectives why they requested those. We thought that would be a really good thing. I want, as we go through these, I'd like to ask you in the Q&A feature that you see on the WebEx, please do send your questions. We don't know how many of those we will get to at the end of our discussion today, but please do send the questions, because every single one of them will be saved, and we will utilize everything you say in your questions when we do our continued review and finalize version 2 of the MCTA. So we want to give as many chances as possible for people to provide feedback. So if we make you think of something today during this discussion, the presentation of the section edit, please share that via the QA, because we want to hear from you and we want to consider it as we're finalizing this. And I think I was going to mention, Jamie briefly alluded to, but I want to stress the importance of providing and if need be, updating your company or institution-specific terms, things that are in this template that you can't agree to. Because as Jamie said, you're able to look at that next to the template and know what's ahead of you in a negotiation when you go into it. And it's a great tool to go shopping for the right sites or the right sponsors for you, because you know things in advance that you don't have to spend your very valuable time finding out through protracted discussion. So that's a very, very important aspect of this work, and we encourage you to participate and to update that as need be. So with that, I want to go ahead and move into letting some folks talk about the edits that have been made to the template. First, we have Jane Hurling here from Mainline Health to talk about Section 9 and edits that she requested to the study device section. Jane?
Good afternoon. Thank you. I am pleased to have been included. I'm, again, Jane Hurling, and I'm Senior Counsel in the Mainline Health System, which is outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I made a comment to Section 9, which is the study device section. I see it's up on the screen. This section addresses use of the study device, which is limited only to the protocol use and only in compliance with applicable law, including the IDE regulations. And it points out that the sponsor is the regulatory sponsor, meaning, in my mind, that the sponsor really is responsible for ensuring that the device is used in compliance with the protocol and compliance with applicable law, including the IDE regs. Given the importance of the sponsor's compliance and insurance or assurance of compliance, not only for possible future use and approval of the device, but for subject safety today, having the sponsor simply agree that it has, past tense, complied with all applicable laws, to me was insufficient. As the institutions and investigators who will actually enroll patients in these early feasibility first-in-human device trials, I think we've got to know that the sponsor has been and is currently compliant. That's the represents part, the past and the current, and that they will in the future remain compliant, and that's the warrants part. So assurance that the sponsor is compliant with all of the applicable laws with respect to the use of the device is the foundation that I think is necessary to give institutions and investigators confidence when they enroll patients into these early feasibility studies. So, you know, I'm sure we've all read academic debates about whether represents and warrants in contracts is redundant and whether it's old-fashioned, whether we should, you know, use things like states and agrees, which is in the current version of the agreement. But in this case, in my view, it seems appropriate to highlight through use of the words represents and warrants that the sponsor's promise of past, present, and future compliance with respect to the device is really a material inducement to the institutions and investigators' willingness to participate in the early feasibility study. Further, I think that use of represents and warrants in this section really is already well harmonized with Section 20.1 of the agreement, which is sponsors' indemnification, which specifically provides for indemnification in the event of sponsors' negligence, breach of the agreement, or failure to comply with the law. So it seemed to me that it was appropriate to highlight that promise here, recognizing that I don't think it really introduces incremental risk to the sponsor that is not already undertaken by the sponsor in Section 20.1. So the additional revision to this section I did not propose, the revision that says, and receiving due authorization prior to commencement of the study, although I like it very much. I find that that is certainly a key component of the required compliance. So that summarizes really the basis for my suggestion, and I turn it back to our moderators.
Thanks, Jane. Appreciate that. And so for clarity, before we move to the next section, Jane had mentioned that she didn't propose the second edit there. That was from another site that proposed that. In our process of comparing the feedback with our prior work and observations from the Legal Roundtable, our team was persuaded by Jane's explanation and also found that the other edit reasonable. So the current plan, when you see these red lines in these sections, is to make those changes to the template, the version 2 of the template that you'll receive. If you disagree or have additional feedback on that, please, again, submit those through the Q&A, because we would like to hear from people and have that included when we make our analysis that we need to do to finalize the version 2. And so now moving on to Section 10. This was not one that we discussed, I don't think, at the legal roundtable, but it was interesting to us. We were persuaded that it would not be problematic that we thought, and so I want to let the author, Sean Perry from Northwestern University, speak to his rationale for proposing this modification.
Okay. Thanks so much, and thanks so much, Mitch, and everyone. So this is Sean Perry. I'm the Associate Director for Corporate Contracts at Northwestern University. So good afternoon. And the reason why we added this is we typically try to include this short disclaimer in all of our research contracts to kind of set the stage that, you know, the standard of performance here is one of reasonable best efforts. That's the effort we're committing. And by disclaiming warranties, it helps to reify that position. But it also, we found in particular when working with startups or smaller companies, this is a really helpful tool to make it clear when, you know, they might have a different perspective on what the standard is of performance. You know, you want to avoid things like reperformance issues and the like. It also helps to, I think, strengthen, and granted, this, I don't know that there's been an IRS ruling on this, but I think it helps to strengthen the argument as a tax-exempt institution that what you're doing here is research as opposed to fee-for-service type of thing, although I think we all know clinical trials kind of dance very close to fee-for-service, but this helps to kind of strengthen the idea that, you know, what we're doing is research on a reasonable best efforts basis. So that is, we've typically had pretty good luck getting this into contracts, and we haven't had too much pushback. I think most sponsors agree with this and understand that, you know, as a research institution, that's the standard of performance we're doing and that we can't warrant anything that we're doing. So anyway, that's it in a nutshell. Happy to discuss more if anyone has any questions.
Thanks, Sean. Appreciate that. Again, Q&A, please submit about that. And we'll move now to 11.5, record retention. I agreed to take this one. This will be brief. However, I wanted to, and I spoke with the group about touching on this because I'd like to invite further comment on this. And basically, what we noticed most about all of the feedback, and there was a lot about this, and it's understandable because people are differently positioned and institutions are differently positioned in what they can offer in terms of this retention, which is that there's a tension with that because sponsors obviously will need access to this data. It's incredibly important given what they've invested, and they're likely to need it for a longer period of time given how soon in the process this is and how early these trials are. So understanding those concerns, we were not surprised when we saw proposals about retention time all over the map. And so what we tried to do was pick a number that was relatively in the middle for people, knowing that this will likely be something that goes on your institution and company-specific terms in your term sheet. There were a couple of edits. This was heavily negotiated at the in-person legal roundtable in 2018. And it was incredibly important to sponsors to be able to request an extension of the storage period. And that was not objectionable to sites. Of course, they asked for payment for it, and sponsors didn't have a problem with that. Two things that came this time were, during this round of feedback, were a limitation on the additional storage time, and that was proposed, as you can see, at 10 years. And our group, after considering everything that sponsors had said and the numbers of years they proposed, felt that that would be manageable if we went to a total of 25 years with sponsor paying for the last 10 years of that. The other change, and the justification for this was persuasive to the team, was to go from reasonable expense to actual retention costs. The justification, in a nutshell, being the storage costs what it costs, and there's not really a lot of presumed nefarious purpose that the sponsor or that the institution would have the motivation to go out and find the most expensive storage provider. In fact, they're going to probably, of course, leave it where they have it, and they just want the ability to do that and be reimbursed for that and not have to make changes to fit within a reasonableness standard that might be applied. So those were comments that, again, were persuasive to the group analyzing this, and I will move this along to 15.3 to have Jamie talk about that.
Thank you, Mitch. So I initially said that intellectual property took us about 2.5 hours to discuss, so I have about 10 minutes here. We're going to focus on section 15.3, which is inventions. And we received a lot of feedback, actually, on this section, so I thought I would just go through and explain some of the changes that were requested, some that we were able to accept in this provision, and the rationale for not being able to at least accept in this provision some of the changes that were proposed. So let's start with about 8 lines down from the top with the sentence that begins, each of institution, principal investigator, and study personnel hereby assigns to sponsor all rights in and to said sponsor intellectual property. There was a request to take out principal investigator and study personnel because a couple of institutions came back and said they would never be parties to the agreement, and it would always be their institution that would be assigning to the sponsor. But we actually realized that there are some institutions out there that would have the principal investigators especially be parties to this agreement and may need to assign individually because they don't have policies and procedures or agreements with those positions in place. So we created an alternative. So we're leaving the principal investigator and study personnel in that sentence that I just read, but we then added in the event principal investigator and or study personnel are not parties to this agreement, institution shall have in place agreements or policies sufficient to ensure that institution may make such assignment effective and binding on itself and principal investigator and study personnel. In addition, institution agrees to make such assignment. So hopefully that is an acceptable compromise to deal with both scenarios. If the principal investigator is a party to this agreement, or if the institution has this agreement and signs off on it and already has either agreements or policies that are sufficient where the institution can assign those rights to the sponsor. So that's the first change there. Some other just housekeeping changes, adding principal in front of investigator. We also received a request for the option period to be shortened to 90 days. So right now it's set at 180 days that the sponsor has to exercise that period. This was another contentious item that was highly discussed at the in-person legal roundtable. A lot of these dates were. And we ended up on 180 days because the sponsors really pushed for this. They wanted 180 days because they are also large corporations and they have to assess the technology. First, it needs to be disclosed to them. They have to figure out, is this something that really makes sense? And it can just take that amount of time. So they really pushed back on having they would prefer to have 180 days to exercise that option. However, we do have that 90 days, and that was always 90. We just added the word 90 in front of the 90 in that next sentence. So sponsor and the institution fail to reach a mutually agreeable license agreement within 90 days from the date on which the option is exercised, the institution basically has no further obligations. Okay, except for within that first year, this is when now the institution could potentially find another licensee for other inventions. So for other inventions, they would need to, they can't actually offer under more favorable terms for these other inventions to someone else without giving that sponsor that first option. However, we wanted to limit that amount of time to actually negotiate that license agreement. So it's not going to, stay out there for an extended amount of time. So we thought this would be reasonable for that 90-day period. So if the license is not negotiated within 90 days after such offer of those more favorable terms to sponsor, institutions shall be free to license the other inventions in question to third parties without further obligation to the sponsor. So again, we'd love, additional feedback on that, but we thought that was a reasonable compromise and to all of the invention section.
Mm-hmm. And one quick thing on that, this is Mitch, in those discussions, I would point out if you have feedback on the last point in invention, I do want to stress that we're talking about other inventions and look carefully at the definition there. We're talking about those independently developed things, so it's not IP really stemming from what sponsors developed. I mean, so that's one of the reasons we thought that 90 days was okay.
That's exactly right. Like the top part is really dealing with the sponsor intellectual property, and the bottom part of 15.3 is really dealing with other inventions.
Right.
And so, reading through that in detail, I think will be very helpful. But we would love your feedback on, those changes for both sections.
Okay, so we're going to move to 16.1, which was another section we had some new feedback on, and some things we thought were good for discussion and solicit some QA feedback from you guys as we move forward to finalize the version 2 of the MCTA. So most of what we worked on here was around the exceptions. And the first ask here from a site was to say that it's not just written documentation, but also other competent evidence that this was known to them. And our group in our analysis was persuaded that there really may be times when there's something that would be agreeable to everyone, that it's not necessarily documented, but a conversation that could be recalled by someone, some other media that we have that really, we don't want to just simply say written documentation. If a sponsor doesn't find that to be, quote, competent evidence, they may then say so. But we thought that should not be objectionable. And then the other add onto 16.1.1 was to talk about the requirements that the information not be subject to any confidentiality restrictions, and the ask was to add with sponsor. So it would not violate something that was owed to sponsor, not necessarily something owed to a third party would trigger that. So that we judged to be reasonable. Again, love your feedback to that. In 16.1.2, this was another ask, a site ask that said, essentially the rationale was, we can't know the entire universe of every agreement or obligation that is out there, and so we think it's fair if we act reasonably subject to that standard and we make a due inquiry and don't find a restriction, then we think it's fair that ought to be able to be disclosed. And our group, again, in analyzing that, said, that there remains a duty on the person wishing to disclose to make that inquiry, and that provides sufficient protection of that information. Because, again, with that language, they'll have to demonstrate that there was due inquiry. So then, moving to 16.1.4, the first edit there was to add the phrase without reliance upon confidential information. And we thought, sure, that's a reasonable ask from a sponsor, that if we're independently developing, but everything comes from the sponsor's playbook in various sources, that's probably pretty fair to add that restriction on there. And then the other was a reflection of the evidence needed to show the exception, the ask was to put that other competent evidence here too. And again, we thought that was a reasonable ask. The new concept that came in to 1615 was a new exception for the need to disclose confidential information to provide necessary medical treatment. This was important to sites as bearing the responsibility for these folks. In thinking about this, what our group did, knowing that any additional exception is always a concern to sponsors, we want to be sensitive to that, and we anticipated this request from sponsors in our group and basically put in a minimum necessary standard saying that, yes, we can disclose it for that, but I mean, it needs to be tailored to what truly is needed to provide that care. So those were the new edits to exceptions to confidentiality. Again, the plan is now to include those in version 2, but please submit your Q&A. If we can talk about those today with time, we will. But if not, we definitely want to hear from you because we want to consider your feedback as we finalize version 2. And with that, we are going to move to section 20.3, reimbursement of medical expenses. And Elizabeth Cothran, our Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Baylor Scott & White Research Institute, is going to address that for us.
Hello, thank you, Mitch. So this section is talking about the reimbursement for medical expenses and as it applies to the relationship between the sponsor and the site. And there was some really good feedback on this. One of the requests that has been taken out is the request to remove the restriction of at rates that constitute fair market value for industry-sponsored studies. I think when we discussed this among our team, it made sense that this be taken out because that's a restriction that may be hard to prove. Fair market value for this early type of research may be difficult to ascertain, as well as sometimes it's outside of the site's control. They may have sought emergency medical care at another institution, and that is what the bill is. So that was why we agreed to take that out. Then on down below where it's talking about procedures for the subject, procedures that the subject would not have undergone but for participation in the study or the sponsor's negligence. And then there was also a request, which we did not change. There was a request in the notwithstanding the foregoing reaction, illness, or injury, notwithstanding the foregoing, the sponsor's obligation to reimburse institution will be reduced to they wanted it, there was a request to change and to add in not apply. So the sponsor their requirement to reimburse not apply if the injury is attributable to basically the control of the investigator. We discussed that and determined that the will be reduced is the most appropriate term there because there could be a situation where there was shared responsibility, and we didn't want the sites to be put in a position to where their responsibility was only a portion of the cause, but now the sponsor's obligation has been taken away. So we left that in with reduced to. And then there was a request to remove the if applicable, there's a known risk of the FDA approved treatment or approved treatment or device of the type being studied. Again, decided that was very broad and really not, just because it was a known risk or a known risk of the device, a known risk of the treatment, because these are very early, there's a possibility that it may still be related to that would not be an appropriate exclusion. And so we agreed that was appropriate to take out. And then adding in, breach of applicable on what comes down now to the number 3, the breach of applicable laws by the institution, and instead of just by applicable laws, violation of the applicable laws. So that was more of a correction. And that's what we've got in there. And again, any feedback is welcome. We're interested in getting others' takes on it, but that's what we've applied in.
Great. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. We are running ahead of schedule, happily, and we have some questions. And we'll get to our closing in a little bit, but I think we'd like to see if we can knock some of these out and address some of the feedback we've gotten. So there was a question regarding the proposed disclaimer in Section 10, the disclaimer of warranties. And the question is whether that could be qualified to say, except as otherwise agreed, this disclaimer would apply. You know, I don't know that I necessarily have a problem with that. Since we do have since Sean is sitting on our panel, I'd like to kind of, and he proposed the change, I'd kind of like to ask his thoughts on that.
Hi, yeah, this is Sean, so thank you, Mitch. Yeah, I think I don't see why that wouldn't be a problem. Like I said, this really just kind of reifies the standard that we're looking at, standard of performance, so I think that's fine. I don't know if other sites might have thoughts on that, or if this is something that maybe we're anomalous in trying to include this in our contracts, but this is, I don't see why that would be a problem.
Right. So we'll plan to do that when we do our finalization. If other sites have thoughts on that, please do submit Q&A. We're saving all of those. Okay, and then I think the next thing we have is in inventions, 15.3, and the question has been asked: shouldn't locating our language here. So the question has been, shouldn't the 180-day option period run from the expiration of the particular study? As written, it would run from the expiration of the master agreement itself, which could go on indefinitely. So we might propose instead to refer to the SOW. I mean, as a site representative, I don't know that I have a problem with that.
No, I also agree with that.
Yeah, that's a nice catch.
That is a good catch.
So we'll plan to include that, and there may be some additional tweaking of the language that we have to do. But I think in concept, that's a good catch. So
that is, and that it was written that way from the legal roundtable, with expiration date changing to expiration of this agreement. So, so yeah, that's a great catch. Thank you.
So we also had a question on 20.3. Section 20.3, is this section intended to drive EFS studies to not use tables of costs for establishing a plan for reimbursement for each case? Elizabeth? I don't recall discussion at the legal roundtable that
limited
where people said that was the motivation.
No, I don't remember that either.
Could we repeat the comment?
Sure. The comment was, is Section 20.3 intended to drive EFS studies to not use tables of costs for establishing a plan for reimbursement for each case? And for the folks here who participated at Legal Roundtable, I don't think any of us, at least not an expressed motivation for that section.
I don't remember that coming up at all.
We will review that
yeah, we'll definitely review that. And if there's any other, I mean, it sounds like a sponsor is concerned about that change. So if there's any other information or rationale that you can provide to help us understand why taking this out might be a problem, please let us know. But it wasn't to avoid use of those tables. I mean, if that's your practice to utilize those tables, it certainly makes sense. And by taking that section out, it was not the intent.
There have been a couple of comments about the strike of fair market value, and we will. I mean, the comment being that's intended to give sponsors some idea of what they're in for and what they're going to pay. It's also pointed out that that's a nod to and a kickback that improper payments won't be hidden with that. I think that. Site concerns with that have really focused around the fact that these studies involve such innovative devices that it's hard to know what that fair market value is. However, I mean, I see sponsor concerns with that. I don't know that there's anyone who would say that we've got a problem with recitation language saying that we won't act improperly, and I think those are things we have notes of those, and I think those are things that we'll definitely evaluate in considering whether to return that language or whether to offer some alternative as we finalize the document. Anybody else on our panel have anything to say about that?
No.
Okay. And while we're on Section 3, we've had some site comments that it's not their other sites saying it's not their motivation to drive you away from using tables to identify costs.
So we had another question come up regarding other inventions. Could the licensing language be revised to allow the option B to negotiate an exclusive or non-exclusive license? The rationale is that there are situations when background inventions are applicable to multiple devices.
So the concern that the background inventions would be caught by that other inventions definition.
So, okay, with the other inventions, I feel like that's a fair point.
Yeah.
We can put in some language to address that.
Yeah.
That makes sense. If others have any
feedback on that point,
please let us know.
or suggestions of what you'd like to see changed in that, I mean, please feel free to suggest. Oh, so there's another request to have, going back to 20.3, and sorry, we're skipping around in these to as they come. So there was a question whether a tail coverage could be added to subject injury coverage, given that as it's written, it's only covering injuries that occurred during the study. And I think that's a very fair question. I think we'd love if anyone wants to comment on that. We may seek some other feedback in considering that as we finalize. Okay. Okay, so we're getting close to the end of our hour, but I'm glad we were able to get some of those addressed. There are others coming in, and as I've reassured, we will take each of those as our group analyzes and prepares to finalize the version 2 of the MCTA. So with just a few kind of closing matters, I will turn it over to Jamie.
Thank you, Mitch. So we really appreciate everyone taking the time to be on the call today. The in-person legal roundtable was absolutely fantastic, I thought, and not just because we held it here in Dallas at Baylor, but just to have sites and sponsors, experts in the field in a room together explaining their point of view. It was just so helpful to have that interaction, and we try to take some of that rationale and apply it today to this webinar. And it's certainly not as easy. It's lovely when you have the opportunity to get everyone in a room together. And so I'd love your feedback on, would everyone be willing to get in a room together? Would you like to do another in-person legal roundtable? And would that be beneficial? The people that participated last time, and we received great feedback, and they thought it was beneficial, and I just think there have been so many new sites and sponsors that have been added to the network, the EFS network, since the legal roundtable, that it would be beneficial to have them participate in something like this where we could have those open and frank discussions once again. So please provide some feedback on that. Any comments, suggestions, red line changes, all of that has been captured today, and we will try to harmonize it and send something out, address what we can. We will definitely be sending out another template master clinical trial agreement for EFS. Once we have an opportunity to actually look at all of these changes that have been sent in and review some comments, we might need to reach out to some of you individually to have discussions related to some of the comments and the feedback. Mitch, did you want to add something?
Yeah, sorry. Just so the group will know, we will be, we'll provide you with a timeline to deliver that to you. We just weren't able to do it today because we didn't know what we would see in terms of the Q&A, and we've already had several ideas and notes passed around about folks we need to reach out to have some suggestions for different provisions as we finalize version 2. Another thing I wanted to briefly say to this group as we're closing here is, again, stress, please let us know how you think the webinar format works, and if you think it would work if done differently than we did it today, please let us know about that. And if you have other suggestions, Baylor Scott & White and the MDIC, I'm sure, would welcome your ideas about how we could continue this work, because it's been so beneficial just hearing Jamie tell the story all the way from single provisions and nuggets of help in an agreement to an agreement that is far closer to being a way to just get to fair fast. So if you have thoughts on, I don't know how to do one of these, but a tweet chat or any kind of exchange, any kind of way to have a dialogue about this, we would really appreciate that, because I think what we hope to do is craft these two events that we've had, the webinar and the in-person meeting, into an ongoing strategy to keep this tool evolving so that it remains useful and relevant and gets more useful over time. So appreciate all of your feedback on that.
And just one other comment. October 2nd and 3rd, please either mark your calendars or spread the word amongst your organization. We will be hosting an EFS, IRB, and regulatory workshop where we hope to take the same approach to drafting informed consent templates, the one-pager document under the new common rule, as well as having an open discussion about utilizing central IRBs for EFS studies. An agenda will be coming out shortly for that meeting, but we would love for representatives to participate from your institutions as well.
Yeah, that'll be really beneficial. Elizabeth and her team do a fantastic job with our regulatory work, and I'm sure they're going to have a really informative and helpful presentation for you.
Okay, and with that, we will conclude. Thank you again.